Okay. Today I'd like to do, we did till now Mekoros at Tefillah. I'd like to do Mekoros of the Haggadah Shel Pesach. What we did with Tefillah, we'll do the Haggadah Shel Pesach from now till Pesach. As a matter of fact, the whole concept of doing Mekoros at Tefillah, I was inspired by what I once worked on, the Mekoros of Haggadah Shel Pesach. It's interesting, when people talk on the Haggadah, they always talk about the Baal Haggadah. This anonymous Baal Haggadah person sat down and wrote the Haggadah. And I always wondered why no one ever talks about the Baal HaSidur, the person who wrote the Siddur. And the real answer is that even though Derech Drash, a lot of Sfarim talk about the Baal Haggadah, there is no Baal Haggadah and there is no Baal HaSidur. There wasn't one person who sat down and wrote a Haggadah. There wasn't one person who sat down and wrote a Siddur. It's something which is based on chiyuvim that we have, and over time, yes?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to catch on my work. Some people don't even know about that, brother.
Again, we said there's a lot of drash, but we're talking about over here that there is, al pi derech pshat, there is no person who wrote the Haggadah. It's something that developed over time. L'mashal, one of the first things people say in Haggadah is Kadesh Urchatz Karpas Yachatz. That's not from Eliyahu Hanavi. That was one of the Rishonim in Ashkenaz wrote a piyut. He wrote a poem, and this poem goes through all the different parts of that we do the night of Seder. So if you notice, even to Adiyam Ezeh, children sing it, but it's really a poem, Kadesh Urchatz Karpas Yachatz. The Rav Heidenheim, to make the poem work better, he changes Rochza to Rachatz. So it's Kadesh Urchatz Karpas Yachatz, Magid Rachatz, Moitzi Matzo, Mor Koirech, Shulchan Oirech, Tzafon Borech, Halel Nirtza. That's the way it works. And it's interesting because that it comes from one of the Chachmei Ashkenaz. I always wondered, if you notice, there's something missing. How many times do we wash our hands the night of the Seder? You're supposed to wash your hands 3 times. Once before Karpas, to dip it into the salt water. One time you're supposed to wash your hands before you make Hamoitzi, and another time you should wash your hands for Mayim HaChroinim. But there's no simon for Mayim HaChroinim. Why not? The answer is the Bali HaTosis hold that we don't wash Mayim HaChroinim. I think Adiyam Azeh Yekes don't fear to wash Mayim HaChroinim, because that's the old Ashkenaz minig, that they held that there's no Melch Shleimus Mitzuya B'neinu, so they don't watch Mayim HaChroinim. So it makes a lot of sense that the author of this poem, one of the Chachmei Ashkenaz, Chachmei Tzarfatim, left out Mayim HaChroinim because he didn't wash Mayim HaChroinim. Of course, we do wash Mayim HaChroinim. We should wash Mayim HaChroinim. So this is not did not. So that's why this is, again, not part of this person who wrote down the Haggadah. This is a poem. It's a piyut that was written by one of the Rishonim. Not to be minimized. If a Rishon wrote a piyut, it should be analyzed very carefully. And the Machzavitri brings a b'shem Seder Orach Shasider Rabbeinu Shloime B'Rabbi Yitzchak, but there doesn't have Yachatz at all. But that's basically the Kadesh Orchatz. There are certain things that we do Leah Seder, also has Shav Makar. L'mashal, we do Heseba. Now in the Mishnah, you're not going to find anywhere it says that a person has to do a seba as like a mitzvah lahasei b'leila seder. It just says lo yoichal acha yosev. You don't eat until you do haseba. And all the time they always ate beseba. This that we have the manishtana, we say that comes later, because the Zman Gemara wouldn't make sense. Zman Mishnah, it wouldn't make sense to ask that question because they always ate beseba. That's the way they ate. Always the Mishnah talks about they sat down to eat. Says hesebu lechol. There's nothing unique about Leil HaSeder in that way. It just says in the Mishnah, Lo yoichal acha yosef, until you sit down by the Suda at night. But the Gemara talks already about who does have to do a seba, who doesn't have to do a seba. And we all know the Rav Yah has a sheet that because B'zman Hazeh, we don't do a seba, so it'll be the Eved, it's not ma'akiv. What about the Arba Koises, the 4 Koises? So very interesting, the mitzvah of Arba Koises, the Mishnah says that if you'll only be Yisrael, you have to give him Arba Koises. It doesn't say mitzvah lishtais Arba Koises, you have to drink Arba Koises. And also, the source for why we drink Arba Koises, Rashi and the Rishbam both bring midrashim of Yerushalmi origin kind of midrashim that the Medrash says Keneged Arba L'Shayin Shel Geula. But in the Bavli, nowhere in the Talmud Bavli does it say that we do 4 koises for any specific reason. All the Bavli says is a person makes kiddush ala kois. So you have to have a kois. You make the bracha of Asher Galanu ala kois. You need a kois. You have to bench ala kois. You need another kois. And then you have to say Halil ala kois. So altogether you have 4 koises. As a matter of fact, it according to Rabbeinu Chananel, it says Chamishi. He has a girsa Chamishi Omer of Halal Hagadol, and according to that, Reb Tarfon holds you have to have a fifth kais for Halal Hagadol. So there is no 4 kaises. It depends on how many kaises. Things you say al kais, that's how many kaises you need. But Yerushalmi doesn't say like that. Yerushalmi has mefurish, like the midrashim that come from Yerushalmi. A lot of midrashim, the Shainim sometimes will say Yerushalmi. You won't find it in Yerushalmi. You find it in like the Bereshis Rabbah. You'll find it in Shemois Rabbah. Those are Yerushalmi kind of midrashim. Just like there's the Gemara comes from Babel, comes from Yerushalmi. There are midrashim that originate from Babel and from Eretz Yisrael, and very often the Yerushalmi kind of midrashim will be consistent with Yerushalmi, not with the Bavli. And sure enough, in the Yerushalmi, in Perek Yud Halacha Aleph, it says, Minayim arba koises. How do we know there's arba koises? So the Yerushalmi certainly treats it as a chiyuv to have arba koises. The question is, how old is this chiyuv? The fact that the Yerushalmi asks where we know it from, the Yerushalmi brings multiple sources for arba koises, is an indication the Yerushalmi didn't have a clear tradition of where it comes from. Just, we know we drink arba koises, so what's the origin of the arba koises? I saw once a very interesting thing, based on things that we've discussed in the past. We call it arba koises. Aleph Reish Beis Ayin. In Lashon Akeva, it's arba imahois, right? But it's shloisha avos, not shalosh avos. Numbers a little bit reversed. Usually a hey at the end is an indication of the keva, but when it comes to numbers, in single numbers, single digits, so you have arba is nekeva and arba'a avos nazikin. That would be lashon zachar. Now in the Mishnah it says moizgim like kois rishon. It doesn't say rishayna. So the Mishnah refers to the kois as lashon zachar. So why is it arba koisois? It should have been arba'a koisois. Interesting question, but I'm not here to say. I was going to say before. Everyone has a lot of Dvar Torah to say on the Haggadah. We're not here to share Divrei Torah. We're trying to focus on the Mekayris of the Haggadah. So this could be used as a Mekar Haggadah. I think in the Goldschmidt Haggadah he says that arba in the kois, the word kois in biblical Hebrew is lashon nekeva. In rabbinical Hebrew, we discussed many times the distinction between lashon Torah and lashon chud and lashon chachamim l'chud. In lashon Torah, kois is nekeva, so it would be appropriate to say arba koisois. But in lashon chachamim, it's lashon zachar. That's why in the Mishnah talks about kois rishon, kois sheni. The Mishnah is kois rishon, kois sheni. But when the name which predates the lashon chachamim, the name that dates back to lashon Torah, perhaps sometimes the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah or mehem kam and neviim that they still did lashon Torah. So that in the name it's called arba koises. So that will be an indication of an early origin of arba koises, because the fact that it's called arba koises in lashon of a Torah, that would show that it dates back at least to the time of Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. It's a theory, it's not a fact, but that would be how we can analyze the lashon itself to see how to date it. So in the Bavli, there could be an argument to be made that there is no entity called arba koises. It's just that there happens to be. There's 4 mitzvahs that require a kois. In the Yerushalmi, you can't say that. Yerushalmi says clearly minayin la'arba koises, and Yerushalmi brings sources like keneged the arba l'shonis of Geula. Okay, first thing that we say in the Haggadah after the piyut of Kadesh Orchatz is the actual Kiddush. Kiddush is comprised of a few parts. There's Birchas HaGofen. You make a birchas, what's called birchas hayayin, and that is mefurish in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says mazguloi kosrishin beishamay oim beisil oimrim mevarach alayayin. So again, we're trying to always find the source. There's no question. There's not from the Gaonim to make a birchas hayayin. It's in the Mishnah to make birchas hayayin. The next bracha we recite is the bracha of Asher b'chabonu mikalam. That's the birchas hayoim. We end of baruch ato Hashem ekadesh shel v'azmanim. That's also based on the Mishnah. Beis Hillel say that on mevarech al yaim achach mevarech al hayoim mefurish that you make a bracha on the yoim, and the Gemara in Kufid Zayin with Beis in Masechtas Pesachim, the Gemara says that you're supposed to end it off mekadesh shel v'azmanim. Interestingly enough, in Masechtas Seifrim there's a different ending to the bracha. It says baruch mekadesh ami yisrael me'adis simcha v'azmanim ekrei kodesh. We don't do that. We do it like it says in the Gemara in the Bavli. And it's important to note that I started out by saying that there was no Baal Haggadah, it's just things, but we have to realize that everything we do, we are fulfilling either a minig or a chiyuv. Sometimes the minig is like a minig, let's say, to recite the piyut from one of the Rishonim of Kadesh Orchatz Karpas Yachatz. Sometimes, I know that's mamish a minig to recite it, but it definitely has become a minig to recite that piyut. But then there's actual obligations. Medina the Mishnah, you have to say the bracha of Boyer Priagofen. And then Medina the Mishnah, you have to go ahead and recite the bracha in the Birchas Hayom. Then comes Shechiyanu. Shechiyanu is also mefurish in Pesachim Kov Beis Amid Beis. It says that you're supposed to make a bracha al azman Shechiyanu. And the Gemara in Pesachim the Zayin Amid Beis says mefurish that the nusach habracha is Shechiyanu v'kimonu v'giyanu lazman hazeh. Interesting, in the Ga'onim, and just like in the Siddur, we saw that the Ga'onim play a very large role in the final redaction of the Siddur. Not final, but in pretty much most of what we have today. The Ga'onim play a very large role in the redaction of the final redaction of the Haggadah as well. But the Ga'onim have a very interesting thing. The Ga'onim speak about, both in Seder Amram Goyin and the Rishonim speak about, that you shouldn't say the bracha of She'as Nisim. Now, whenever someone tells, my 10th K Rebbe taught us, whenever Tosfos says, Ve'ein loymar, don't say, means somebody says it. Rabbi Kempler used to say that. If it says Ve'ein loymar, you don't say, it means someone says it. Whenever Tosfos says Ve'ein loymar, go find the other Rishon who says it. So if the Rishonim are telling us, don't say a bracha She'as Nisim, don't make the bracha She'as Nisim, it means that somebody says that you should say it. Right? Sure enough, recently, in the Gniza, they found taka that there's a bracha she'asa nisim l'v'seinu b'zman hazeh, and I saw two in two different snippets in the Gniza, which you see that there was such a minig in maybe the Karoim did it, maybe others did it, but there was an excellent minig of saying a bracha she'asa nisim l'v'seinu b'zman hazeh, and therefore the Rishonim find it necessary to tell us not to say the minig, not to say she'asa nisim.
You talk about by the Seder.
By the Seder, by Kiddush by the Seder. If you look in the Yotzeris of Shabbos HaGadol, right? So the Yotzeris Shabbos HaGadol is actually very, very, it's very unique in two ways. First of all, it's very easy to understand. That's number one. Number two, it's from the Gedolei Rishonim, and it's very heavy in halacha. So therefore, the Yotzeris Shabbos HaGadol is a lot can be learned from it, and a lot can be studied. It was written by Yosef Toiv Elam. So if you look at the Yotzes of Shabbos HaGadol, here, he says, first it's Delchas B'dikas Chametz, then he starts with Kiddush. Rishon Mevarach Alayayin V'achar Kiddush Uzman, they say Kiddush Zman, Ve'einoi Oimer Neis Adayin. He's saying in the Yotzes of Shabbos HaGadol, it says, that it says Mevoy Mebeis Rachshan, you come home from that shul, Moiskin Lekos Rishon, you pour the first kos. It's the long Yotzer of Shabbos HaGadol. It starts Alkei Aruchas Techol Basar. So the first half of it is focused more on Bir Chometz and B'dikas Chometz, but about halfway through it says Erev Pesach Lekos Rishon, Lo Yechol Demad Ishan, Mevoy Mebeis Rachshan, Moiskin Lekos Rishon, Rishon Mevorach Alayayin. The first one you make a bracha alayayin, va'achar kach kiddush uzman. Then you say kiddush uzman. Ve'einei oimer neis adayin. Now what is it supposed to mean? Now we know what it means. It means that there was this practice of saying the bracha she'asa nisim l'v'seim yom zman hazeh in part of kiddush, and now the Rishonim told us not to say that. So that's as far as kiddush goes. Now comes orchatz. Orchatz is washing our hands before dipping in karpas. Its origin, again, we're learning the Makairis, is in Pesachim Kuf Tezvav and Aleph, Amr Rabbi Lazar, Amr Rabbi Oshia, Kol Shetibulu Mashkin, Sarchan Til Sidayim. And since we toivel the karpas and mashka, therefore we do Til Sidayim. So again, these are all things. I think a person sits down by the Seder, instead of saying that there's some mysterious Baal HaGad that told him to do all this, realize what you're doing in each thing. You know that when you're saying the bracha of Boyer Priagofen, you're Memkayim Achiyev Medina the Mishnah, the bracha Al Ayoim, Dina the Mishnah, Zman also. It's Dina the Gemara, and you have to say Berachas Hazman. Then you move on and you do Orchatz Dina the Gemara. The Gemara says you should do what you're about to do right now, right? And now comes Karpas. What's Karpas? Now the Mishnah doesn't say any particular vegetable. The Mishnah says that we have first of all the Mishnah refers to Karpas. So a Mishnah that says he's supposed to dip the Karpas in. And also in the Mishnah, Kuf Yudalad Amad Aleph, the Mishnah says, "Hevi lefon of matbel bechazeres." Now the lashon of the Mishnah is mashma that you're supposed to use chazeres, which is morer for karpas, But the Rishonim say that the Mishnah means lav dafke chazeres. It means any vegetable. As a matter of fact, some even have the gears in the Mishnah itself that you could take any vegetable for karpas. So really, karpas could be any vegetable. Any vegetable. You can take a carrot. You could take a lot of people have the minig of taking radishes. Anyone has the minig of a radish? No? What? So why radishes? My grandfather used to also use radishes. My shver says he also used to use radishes before they started with the celery. We'll get that in a minute. But why radishes? So recently a Yid, he comes here once in a while. I think for the Sikkim minion, something he's down here. It's Karen Fisher from Muncie. He's a moil in Muncie. He told me this expression in Yiddish. You tell someone, says verta reitach. You ever heard the expression? It means it's worth nothing. Why is that verta reitach? What's the expression verta reitach? So he said that's something that radishes grows very easily, and everybody would grow their own radishes in the backyard. In other words, he said where he came from, Serdel. My grandfather also came from there. My shviga came from there as well. That everyone had their own reitach growing in the backyard. So that's why I remember, Mashal, my grandfather, even though he was always makbid to peel everything on Pesach. Some people have that minig, they always peel everything. But I remember seeing a red radish. You saw the red peel. Why didn't they peel it? So he says because the reason why people peeled it because they don't know where it came from. They bought it from the outside. But something that you grew in your own backyard, you don't have to peel. So that's why the radish was growing in your backyard. That's the way they used to have the radishes, and that's why everyone used radish. Just interesting, just a fun fact. But any vegetable, really, I always was tempted to use banana for karbas, right? Really, any vegetable could really work. What? Potatoes cannot have been a very old minhag. It's an American invention from the 16th century, I believe. The potato. So potato cannot have been an ancient minhag, right? To go back, but potatoes. We also use potatoes. That's something which people is definitely the right thing to do because any vegetable is good enough. But very interesting is the Rishonim use the word karpas. They say to use karpas, which is a particular vegetable. If you look at the Rabbi Yosef Tev Elam, his lashon is that shakel gargira, or karpasa, or kusbarta, or chasa. It's a different, a whole different buffet of choices of vegetables that you could use. But the Maril said to use karpas. So the Chassam Sofer said if Maril wanted to use karpas, so given shiyotza mipiv of the Maril, so his Rebbe, Rab Nosson Adler, went through great efforts to identify which vegetable is karpas. It's a show that he's not here because he speaks Spanish, right? And he said he came to the conclusion that karpas is what's called in many languages apia. It's celery, which is celery. What? Celery. And the word apia, Chassam Sofer gave a remez as Rosh Tevis Keil Poil Yeshua is Ota. So the Chassam Sofer says an interesting thing. He says my Rebbe Rab Nosson Adler went through a lot of great effort to research what is karpas, and he came to the conclusion that it's afia. But the Chassam Sofer doesn't tell us how did he research it. What was his method of research? What did he do? Went to a local library. What did he do to research this fact? Interesting is the Machzas HaShekel, which is a pirush on the Magen Avram. Machzas HaShekel writes that he knew a Gavra Rabbah who looked in Sifrei Refuah, which means he looked in botanical books, I guess, or something, to come to the conclusion that karpas is afia. So you have two interesting sources. The Chassam Sofer tells us the name of the person, Rab Nosson Adler, but doesn't tell us method of research. The Machzas HaShekel tells us the method of research, doesn't say the name of the person. But it's very safe to assume it's the same person because the Machzas HaShekel knew Rab Nosson Adler and the Chassam Sofer when they were together in Boskowitz. They spent time together. So it's very logical to see if there's two stories of a great man researching the same topic, and one just leaves out the name of the person because he didn't want to write this Adam Gadol looked in Sifrei Refuah. The other one mentions the Adam Gadol, doesn't say exactly his method of research. We could put two and two together and assume it's the same person because they knew each other very well. The Machzas HaShekel, when Rab Nosson Adler had to leave Frankfurt because he was the Kehillah basically threw him out because they didn't like the interesting minhagim that he did. So he went to Boskowitz, and over there he got to know the Machzas HaShekel. We have a hesped that Nosson Adler gave on the Machzas HaShekel. So the Machzas HaShekel is very likely referring to the same story.
And
they use celery. But someone told me some people use what we call celery, And but one of the matzahs of Rav's Einiklach told me that the matzah of Rav himself, who followed himself as minig, didn't use the green part of the celery that we used. He used the head of celery. That's what they put into the soup. But I don't know that makes sense because the Chassam Sofer writes it's nechal kamoy shulchai. You eat it raw. The head of celery is not eaten raw. But this is what I heard from the matzah of a family once, that he used the head of the celery, not the actual celery stalks. But a lot of people who follow this minig, Mashver, uses the celery stalks. That's what they do. Okay, that's as far as karpas goes.
And that's a carp.
That's karpas. Yachatz. Now yachatz is a very interesting thing. There's no Mishnah Meforsha Gemara anywhere that says a person should take a matzah and break it in half. We do that. We take a matzah and break it in half. Again, we're looking for the makar. There's no Meforsha Mishnah, no Meforsha Gemara that says that you break it in half. The most we could find is the Gemara says that Shmuel says lechem oini she'onim al dvarim harbe tainam hachi lechem oini lechem she'onim al dvarim harbe davar acha lechem oini ma oni darki beprusa. Just like an oni, his way is with a prusa, with a slight, like a broken piece of bread, not with a whole loaf. Afkam beprusa. So the Gemara says for that you don't have to go and break it. You could just have a prusa there. You know, people come off the matzah bakery with enough prusas. They don't have to go and do an act of breaking it. So is the actual act, the practice of breaking the matzah, is that something, a requirement? Again, we're trying to find a makar to that. There's no question we all do that. The question is there anywhere that we can point to that says one should take a whole matzah and crack it in half the night of Pesach? So you're not going to find the Meforsha Mishnah or Meforsha Gemara. Another possibility is the Mishnah says, the Mishnah Kufi Dalam analysis, Acha Megia Liparperes Hapas. And the Tosis Yom Tiv brings some gears in the Mishnah that it should be Acha Megia Liparper Hapas. Liparper could mean to crack the bread. Now that will be the case. You would have a Mishnah which tells you to crack the bread, not just the lashon of pirurim. Parpel is like to crumble it. That would be before the Mishnah that Tiferes Yisrael says mefurish. Lefarper hapas, leshaber hapas, like we're noyik to break the matzah. So according to Tiferes Yisrael and the Tosis Yom Tiv, we have a Mishnah telling us to actually break the bread. In the Zoyer, in the Rai Mehemna, Parshas Truma, it says that kigoin matzah the ispalig chetzia tachas hamapel afikoimen basar suuda v'chetzia lemitzvah kodem suuda. So this that we put half in, half there is already brought down in the Zoyar in Parshas Truma. The Rabbi Yosef Teiva Elem, going back to the Yoitzer, again a very early source. Remember, there's an early Rishon. Rashi quotes him. He's a Rishon that's quoted by Rashi. Rabbi Yosef Teiva Elem, and he says that his lashon is that after he did Yitbil b'charois. By the way, I should mention we dip the karpas in salt water, but a lot of Rishonim say to dip it into charoises. Mashal Rabbi Yosef Elem dipped it in charoises, not into salt water. So the kadachel yechza achas mishalesh matzahs. When you eat when you're about to eat, you should break one of the three matzahs. Ve'ein brachi ima mechza bekora mechza b'shulchan asima. So he does mention that you should go and do yachatz, that to go and break the matzahs. It's mefurish in the Rabbi Yosef Teiva Elam. Afterwards comes halach ma'anya. Now, before we get to halach ma'anya, which is usually under the title Magid is halach ma'anya, the whole concept of Haggadah. Right? We say the night of Pesach, we say Haggadah. What is the origin of that? Why should we say Haggadah on the night of Pesach? So that's almost a mefurish pasuk. V'gatal bincha b'yoymahu. It says v'gadatal bincha. So the word Haggadah is in the pasuk. V'gatal bincha b'yoymahu. And the Rambam says from there we learn out that we're supposed to say the Haggadah. The lashon to refer to this recitation as the word Haggadah is mefurish in the Gemara, two Gemaras, Kufta Zvavim Beis and Kufta Zayinim Beis. The Gemara says, Omer Rav Acha B'Yankiv Suma Potim Eloimer Haggadah. So you find mefurish in the Gemara. The Gemara says over there, Shel Tinul Rabbanah Be'Rab Yosef, Man da Omer Agadete Be'Rab Yosef. So also refers to as Haggadah, and Rav Sheshis. And also you have earlier in Kufta Zvavim Beis, the Gemara says, Ein Oikrenes HaShulchan Lefnei Misha Omar Haggadah. So you have already the word Haggadah that's called Haggadah. You have in the Gemara. Now, when it's called Haggadah Shel Pesach, that lashon of Haggadah Shel Pesach, the earliest source to the expression Haggadah Shel Pesach or Haggadah Shel Pesach is also in the Ashkenazi Rishonim. That's Chachmei Tzarfas in Siddur Rashi Siman Shinayin Ches. You find it, and Tosfos and Avodah Zarah Memheim and Aleph calls it Agodas HaPesach. Aleph calls it Agodas HaPesach. So you have the concept called Haggadah Shel Pesach. Interesting, the word Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, you're not going to find anywhere in Chazal. The earliest source of like Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim is in the actual Haggadah on Avodah Mayinu. It says like Saper B'Yetzias Mitzrayim, but the Lashon Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, the way we call the mitzvah, we say, I ask you what mitzvah you're doing? Mitzvah Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Why you say the mitzvah of Gadol Levincha? That's what it says in the Torah. That's because in the Haggadah we call it Saper B'Yetzias Mitzrayim, but the actual expression is Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. You're not going to find in Chazal themselves. So you have Vegadat on the Pasik, you have Haggadah in the Gemara, and you have in the Rishonim Haggadah Shel Pesach. You have the concept of Haggadah Shel Pesach. Of course, the pasuk in Torah, but it doesn't say in the concept as a tzivoy you should go misaper. It just says over there, I'm going to do these moifsim lamant saper so that you will say it over to your children. But the Begatel Bincha Be'emolemar, that says in the Begatel Bincha. The first thing we say is halach ma'anya. Halach ma'anya is very enigmatic, and here's something very important to mention. We're very used to looking at each passage in Haggadah based on how the printers presented it to us, that it's one thing. Halach ma'anya, we look at it as, we say halach ma'anya. Where does halach ma'anya start? It starts with the word ha and ends with the word chayrin. I want to start looking at each line as its own thing. What am I doing with this line? Don't look at it necessarily as one big thing. Who made it one big thing? The printer. He made halach ma'anya as one big statement. I think we could see three distinct things in halach ma'anya. The first thing is you say halach ma'anya diacholu avasana ba'arad Mitzrayim. This is the bread that our Ovis ate in Mitzrayim. Now, what does that mean? What are you saying? Right? What are we saying? So the emes, usually when we do something, we'll always like to say something, like koirech, for example. We say zeichel lemigdash kehilel kach asa hillel. It makes sense that we're doing yachatz, just break, and then what? Right? So you play around with the children a little bit, but what are you doing? So really, if you think about it, what do you just do by yachatz? You just created the dakish l'ani beprusa. So you explain. Ha lach ma'anya de'achal havasanu ba'arad Mitzrayim. The idea that it lends itself to say something, you could look in the Siddur Yavitz, he says that when a person does yachatz, after he does yachatz, he should take it on his shoulder and say, Zecher laviseinu shiyotzim Mitzrayim misharoisam tzruisam samloisam al shechmam. In other words, the Yavitz feels there's something necessary to say over here. I think this is more of a theory, it's not a fact. Everything else we said till now was a fact. There's a theory to say that halach ma'anya is the amira that connects with the yachatz. I did yachatz, now explain. Halach ma'anya de'achal avasana ba'ara de Mitzrayim. The Rashbatz, one of the Rishonim, says that this passage of halach ma'anya is not brought down anywhere in Chazal, not in the Gemara, not in a Medrash. Its earliest source is from Matisyo Goyin, one of the Goinim. He says minig ovis. It's a minig to say this. So again, when you're saying halach ma'anya, that's not according to the Rashbatz. Its origin, that's where our topic is today, is Makar. The Makar is from the Goinim. The Ritva's mashma, that's maybe from the Ameroyim, but he also points out it's not from the Mishnah, it's a Tikkun Ameroyim. What leads him to say that is because it's an Aramaic. So therefore, it's probably from later. You could maybe look at the halach ma'anya as like the little children that come home from school with the ones like a really small, with a miniature Haggadah with like 3 lines in it. And then, so if you look at halach ma'anya, you can look at it as almost like a microcosm. Ritva says that it's meant to be said in Aramaic so that women and children should understand it. So perhaps it's like a mini Haggadah. Halach ma'anya, and then how does the Haggadah end? L'shana b'av Yerushalayim. Perhaps. But again, that's only a theory. But the facts are that it's not in Chazal. It's something which is found in the Goinim, and Ramatisyo Goyin from the Goinim say it's a minig avois to say it. Kol dichven yesei v'yechel. That's a new phrase. That has an origin in the Gemara. The Gemara says in Mesechtes Tainis that Rav Huna, when he would want to eat bread, it was one of the midas chasidus Rav Huna did. He would call vaniyim and he would say kol dichven yesei v'yechel. Before he started eating, he said kol dichven yesei v'yechel. So that is something which makes sense before you start a Suda. You say kol dichven yesei v'yechel. So if we don't have to look at halach ma'anya as one flowing paragraph, you could break it up into 3 sections. Halach ma'anya chalav v'sanam arad Mitzrayim. That's a statement. That statement might be connected to the yachatz. Then we have another statement, which we know from the Gemara in Tainus, Daf Chafam Beis. The Gemara says, "Kol dichvin yesav yechel, kol ditzach yesav," and we add on Pesach, "Kol ditzach yesav yifsach." That's not in the Gemara. The Gemara says only but before you eat. And the last thing is Hashat Ach L'Shana Bo Be'ard Yisrael. So I can't find an origin for that. But in other words, other than the fact that the Ga'inim said that it's a minhag to say this, but we do find in the end of Haggadah, we say L'Shana Bo B'Yerushalayim. But interesting is, I just had this past week, someone complained to me that if you look, you'll find in English translations of Hashata Hacha, L'Shana Bo Be'ard Yisrael. So he showed me that some English translations say Hashata Hacha, now we are here, L'Shana Haba, in the coming year, Be'ard Yisrael. Now we know in the Gemara says Hashta Dasina L'Hacha. Hashta means now. But really, you look at the word is Hashata, this year. So how would you translate it? Hashata Hacha, this year we are here, or Hashta Hacha, it's probably the same word, now we are here. So interesting is, he felt, this person, that the English translation make a mistake by saying Hashata Hacha means now. Hashata Hacha means this year. Hashata, das Yor. I think in Yiddish most people touch Hashata Hacha de Yor. What?
Makes sense.
Yeah. But if you look at the English, I think the Koran translation, it says Hashat Ocha, now we are here. But there is an oddity over here because it says Hashat Ocha, now we're here, Lishana Haba'ah, in the coming year, right? It should have been Lishata the Asya. If it's Aramaic, Hashata Hacha, Lishata the Asya, it should be Ba'arad Yisrael. Hashata Avdei, Lishata the Asya, B'nei Chayrin, Bar Chayrin, Barei Chayrin. It should have said it like that. I saw some theory that maybe I thought the Ivasider even that you were scared the Goyim are going to hear us, that we're trying to run away, so they said it in a Lashon Kodesh so the Goyim should understand. I don't know, but upon him, it's interesting. But that's this passage. So again, to summarize, Holach Ma'anya, for sure, it dates back to the Goyim. Kol dich v'en yesav yechel, that phrase before a Suda has a makar in the Gemara. Hashata Acha, we find a parallel in the end of the Haggadah. Now comes to the real meat and potatoes of the Haggadah. We start with Manishtana Halayla Azeh. And this needs a very clear introduction. When you just say the Haggadah, people just say, they lose idea of the structure of the Haggadah. And listen carefully, because here comes I think you'll never look at the Haggadah itself again the same way you looked until now, if you hear carefully what I'm about to tell you. The Mishnah has 4 questions. The Mishnah in Masechtas Pesachim enumerates 4 questions. Mishnah Kufta Zayin Omid Aleph. It says Mozguloi Kosheni V'Kana Ben Shoyel Manishtan Laizem Kol Aleilos. The Mishnah has 4 questions. The Mishnah has different questions than we have because the Mishnah has every night we eat tzli sholek and mavush alayl zekuloi tzli. We don't have that question because we don't eat the carbon Pesach. So we switch it out with something the Mishnah could not have had, which is because in the times of the Mishnah they always ate Mesubin, so the Mishnah couldn't have had that. That's what we do. But the concept of asking these 4 questions is in the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say after that? And remember, we're following, you sit down, say the night, the Haggadah is here to allow us to fulfill all the obligations that are enumerated in the Mishnah and in the Gemara and in the Ga'inim. So what is and the Rishonim and so on and so forth. When saying Manishtana, it's in the Mishnah that we say Manishtana. What happens next? The Mishnah says after that, that what comes next is Maschel Begnus Mesayim B'Shvach. The Mishnah says Maschel Begnus Mesayim B'Shvach. There's an obligation to begin with saying it used to be bad and now it became good. It was bad and it became good. Now what is Maschel Begnus Mesayim B'Shvach? What is it that you're maschel begnus? What was the bad and what was the good? So you have machlokes in the Gemara of Rav and Shmuel. Right? Rav says maschel begnus is mitchila oivdei v'dezara haya v'seinu. We used to be oivdei v'dezara. Va'achshav kavana mokim lavidasa. Shmuel says that what was the gnus? We used to be avodim, and then what happened? We became free people. Easy to remember who is who because we know we pass like Rav when it comes to Isser. You pass on Shmuel when it comes to Mammon. Rav looks at things through the prism of Isser v'Heter. What's the Gnus? Of the Vaydazara. What's the Shvach? Shmuel looks at the prism of ownership. What was the Gnus? Avodim Ayinu. What's the Shvach? that we're freed. That's Rav and Shmuel. So we know that after the questions comes the response is Maschel B'Gnos U'Mesayim B'Shavach. Now, we do both. The Rabbeinu Chananel says, and all the Rishonim say, we do Rav and Shmuel. So what obligations do we have right now? We have an obligation to ask questions, right? It says the Kana ben Shoyl, and the Mishnah gives us 4 questions. And we have then an obligation to respond with Maschel B'Gnos U'Mesayim B'Shavach. Now, it sounds like it's almost haphazard in the Haggadah. It's not at all haphazard. But I want to introduce one more source. There's a Brisa brought down in the Yerushalmi, and also in other sources of Chazal, that gives another form of the 4 questions. This Brisa, the author of this Brisa is Rav Chia. What are the 4 questions? Those 4 questions are not presented as just questions that are narrated by language of the Chachamim. It's presented as 4 different psukim. Right? You might be very familiar with this Brisa. This Brisa says like this. Chacham ha'omer, question number 1. That's a question. Rasha has another question, also a pasuk. The Tam has another question. Ma zois. The She'eni de Elishol, he doesn't ask a question, but we have to engage him on our own. So this is a parallel, just like a Brisa is very often a parallel to Mishnah, right? You have the Mishnah of Rebbe, and then you have the Brisa of Rav Chia. Classic. Here you have a Mishnah in Masechtas Pesachim, followed in the Yerushalmi by this Brisa. Now look how the Haggadah, I'm trying to avoid using the Baal Haggadah. Here's how the Haggadah organizes this so beautifully. It starts out with the 4 questions in the Mishnah, followed by the Maschel B'Gnos U'Mesayim B'Shvach, according to Shmuel. Then we move on to the 4 questions from the Brisa, followed by the Maschel B'Gnos U'Mesayim B'Shvach of Rav. Right after those 4 questions comes what? And now, when I do my Seder, I tell my children like this. Okay, now we're going to do the 4 questions from the Mishnah. And then we're going to do the Maschel U'Mesayim B'Shvach and Shitas Shmuel. Then when we get to the Arba Bonim, I say, now we're going to do the 4 questions of the Brisa, and then we're going to do the Maschel B'Gnos B'Shvach of Rav. That you're not just randomly rambling on and on. You realize what you're fulfilling. Chiyuvim of Brisas, Mishnayos, and Gemaras. And I think it's not random how it was set up either. Why was the Mishnah paired with Avodah Me'inu, and the 4 questions of the Brisa paired with Rav? So first of all, Chia was Rav's uncle. So it stays in the family. So you have the 4 questions of Rav Chia's Brisa, followed by Rav's Maschel B'Gnos U'Mesayim B'Shevach. And you have Shmuel is paired together with the Mishnah. There's another reason for it. And I don't want to say a reason, more like a pattern. Rav was the big darshan. You have Safra the Beirav, Safri the Beirav. The Gemara says Rav was always darshaning psukim. Rav is, and that's why halachic Rav Yisurim, because Rav is more scripture based. It's more based on psukim always. Shmuel is halachic Shmuel B'din Amamis, which is more divrei chacham, more logic based. More has to do with more svaris. You're not going to find so many psukim in Masechtas Baba Basra. Right? You're not going to find so many psukim. It's all svaris. So if you look at the Mishnayos, the 4 questions of the Mishnah are free without the psukim, just saying the questions. Just asking questions. Avodah Me'inu also Kamat doesn't bring a pasuk. It brings a fragment of a pasuk, but generally it's Avodah Me'inu. Right? Those are just words, not from psukim. It comes to the questions and answers of the Brisa of Rav Chia and Rav's response. It's all psukim based. Take a look, you'll see. All right, Mo'ed Zechukim is a pasuk. All these are psukim. The response is also right. Shenemar. It comes with a shenemar. That's more appropriate for Rav. So if you want to basically categorize these two parts of the Mishnah, you're first going to do in Lashon Chachamim, in Shmuel's world of questions and answers. Then you're going to move over and do things in Lashon of the Psukim, all based around the Psukim. The questions and the answers are based around the Psukim. And now we can follow what the Haggadah is doing over here without feeling it's just random, one piece after the next without any order. First we start 4 questions of the Mishnah. We said before the Mishnah. Then we say Maschel B'Gnus. And if I would say, I suggest, and I do this, we say, okay, now we'll give Maschel B'Gnus. Avodim Ayinu L'Farim Mitzrayim. That's the Maschel B'Gnus. We just said we used to be Avodim. That was terrible. Then look at what great thing happened. Messiah b'shevach. That's the mask of Gunus of Messiah b'shevach. Now, yeah, it became. Now, afterwards, again, I don't like to look at just because the printers made it in one big paragraph as it's one item. I think there's in Avodim, you can find 4 items. Item number 1, Avodim Yifarim Saim, Maskal B'Gnus. Item number 2, Item number 3, the Gemara says that a person should say that the Mishnah says like that, and a person should mention that it's Ki'ilu. So once we're doing that, we do the next obligation, which is but unlike the Gemara, who says that we should say it in a pasuk, here we're doing things totally in Lashon Chachamim, and we're saying it without the pasuk. We're just saying that's the way it would have been. And why would we first do Lashon Chachamim and then we do the Lashon Psukim? We also know Chaviv and Divrei Sofer from Yosem Yein Shel Torah. Very often the Gemara says why the words of Chachamim comes before the words of the Torah. And then we make a statement. We say, "Afilu klon chacham, klon nevanim, klon iskein." We know it's a Torah. That's another statement that we say that a person is chayav l'saper. What follows after this, the Ma'aser Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, is additions to the Haggadah. It's not brought down in the Gemara or in the Mishnah that you're supposed to recite. As a matter of fact, if a person is short on time, let's say he's in a situation, or he's in sakana, or people are not well, or your Mesharsis who's working in a house and she doesn't have the time to say everything, this should be skipped, because this is not an absolute chiyuv. The way to remember this is not an absolute chiyuv is the more time people spend on something, the less obligation there is to it. So this, that people spend half the night talking about Maitna, not that you shouldn't say it, chas v'shalom, it's a minute, but half the night with Ma'aser Rebbe Lezer, that's something, now, a fascinating piece, the Ma'aser Rebbe Lezer piece, the origin of the Ma'aser Rebbe Lezer piece, believe it or not, it's nowhere in Chazal. The only origin for this is in the Haggadah Shel Pesach. This story, Ma'aser Rebbe Lezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rebbe Lezer, Ben Azariah, Rebbe Tarfon, all the story is not brought down anywhere else in Chazal. Its source is the Haggadah Shel Pesach. And I'll prove it to you. Because if you open a Tosis in Avodah Zarah Mem Hayam and Aleph, he cites this story and he says, like it says in Haggadah Shel Pesach. He couldn't find it anywhere else. That's where it is. There is no, exactly the way this story is presented, is brought down nowhere else in Chazal. This is an origin. It's a very interesting thing that Haggadah should have an original story about Chazal that's not brought down anywhere else. The next piece, Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, we're more familiar with. It's a Mishnah, Masechtas Brachos. So it's appropriate. We just said Amar Bel Saper Zayis Meshubach, so we say 2 passages that has to do with Sipur Tziyas Mitzrayim, but it's not an absolute chiyuv of the Haggadah. Then, after we finished the Haggadah, which I call Shmuel's Haggadah, of starting with questions and answers, we move over to Rav's Haggadah. Now, Rav's Haggadah, again, let's not let the printers mess up with us. And I'm going to end with this piece. We start at Baruch Hamokim Baruch Hu, Baruch Shanas Torah Am Yisrael Baruch Hu. Right? What is that? So if you think about it, it sounds almost like Baruch Sha'amar, right? Baruch Shamayel Baruch Hu, Baruch Hamivaisa Baruch Hu, right? It has a very similar pattern, rhythm to what we say with like in Baruch Sha'amar. As a matter of fact, there is in the Haggadah Shlema, very important resource for this way of looking at Haggadah by Nachman Lekasher. He has a nusach Baruch Hamakim Shnas Torah Yisrael Baruch Hu Baruch Oime Va'oise Baruch Shu Goyzer Mekayim Baruch Shein Lefanav Matzipon. He adds more words that's found from the Goinim that you see and from the Geniza. So you see that it is even more similar to Baruch Sha'amar. Now we know the Gemara says Rav, before he started darshaning, he would make a bracha. Rav Mash Yodi Baruch, and then he would tunnel up Perk and he would learn. So before we're about to start the Haggadah, which I'm pinning on Rav, it makes sense to start with some kind of bracha, which is almost like a brechas hatayra. The Rishonim already call it like a brechas hatayra. But in my family, we sing it. We say Baruch Hamoke Baruch Hu Baruch Shasam Shasam Baruch Hu Keneged Arbabane and Debra Hatayra. We sing it together. But that's not really like running in from one thing to the next. This Baruch Hamoke Baruch Hu Baruch Shasam Baruch Hu. That is the bracha before. Keneged Arbabane Debra Hatayra. That's the beginning of the brisa. That's the beginning of the brisa. It's not. We start out by getting like a bracha before we're about to start that. We're about to restart that Haggadah now. We're restarting. So we start with a bracha, Someone asked the question why we don't make a bracha before the Haggadah. So we don't make an absolute bracha before this version of the Haggadah. We make some bracha, and it makes a lot of sense that it's over here because when we just said the words of the Chachamim, you don't make a bracha before. When darshaning psukim, it's more appropriate to make a bracha. So you start with a baruch hamakom baruch hu. That's the bracha that we're about to before we restart the Haggadah, because now we're about to do the Haggadah in the version of Rav and Rav Chia. Then we say the Bryce of Rav Chia. And then we go to the 4 questions over there. And then, now, here's another thing that I've been many times by Seder, and this is why the printers mess people up, and the fact that they don't really know what they're doing. They ask, why, all of a sudden, halfway through the Haggadah, do we start talking about Yochel Meresh Chodesh? What's up now, and you can sit for a half hour and have a discussion. It's, first of all, missing, now there is room for that discussion, but it's missing the context of what you're doing. We just finished saying the She'eni de Lishel at Pesach Le'Shenem. Remember, each one of the children has a pasuk for himself. What pasuk does he have? V'gada to levincha b'yayim ahu leimer b'avuzeh as Hashem li b'teisim Mitzrayim. Yochel Meresh Chodesh is darshaning this pasuk. Why it's here? Because we just said the pasuk, and we're darshaning that pasuk. Our purpose here is to darshan. So we have the pasuk with Gad levincha b'yayim ahu leimer, then we darshan Yochel Meresh Chodesh b'yayim ahu. It's not that. Now the printer, when he makes a new heading called Yachal Meresh Chodesh, so you think you finished the Arba Bonim, you forgot even you ever did it, and now you're saying, why is now Yachal Meresh Chodesh? You missed the context. There's basic context there. There's a lot. I'm not trying to minimize people's Devar Torahs, but first understand what's going on, basic shot of what's going on. Now that you finished the Arba Bonim with that little addition of the Yachal Meresh Chodesh, which is dashing the last pasuk, so now we start again. And we bring a pasuk. I'm going to end over here. That's this week, and next week we'll start from Baruch Shem V'Tachas L'Yisrael. I think it gave it. First of all, we understand the origin of these things, and it gives it some context. It's not just a run-on a monologue that has no rhyme or reason why we go from one subject to the other subject. It's a perfectly organized order. We're first being the kayim, the chiyuvim of questions and answers in the words of Chachamim, and the way it says in the Mishnah, and the way Shmuel says to do Maskel Musayim B'Shevach. Then we take the 4 questions in the Brisa, more centered around darshaning psukim, which is from the Bryce of Rav Chia, with the response of Rav, and now we are ready at this point, the person can tell himself, I already fulfilled my obligation in 2 different versions of the 4 questions, and I fulfilled my obligation of 2 different versions of Maskel B'Gnos U'Mesayim B'Shevach, and it's even possible I already fulfilled my obligation of saying that Ki'ilu Hu Yatza Mitzrayim. But he still has more obligations ahead of himself. He has to dash that pasuk of Arami Ovid Avi. He has other things that he has to say, and we'll get to that.